Okay, and we were going back to the actual flyers and the first iterations.
On May 3rd, the night of the meeting, after the meeting, Adolf Fischer, who was an assistant editor at the Arbiter-Zeitung with August Spies, created a flyer, and it was in the typical 7x10 size, hand set, and he printed a flyer calling for a mass meeting, attention working men, mass meeting, tonight at 7:30 p.m., and that was to be distributed the next day. And what it said was, good speakers will be present to denounce the latest atrocious act of the police, the shooting of our fellow workmen yesterday afternoon. And then underneath it, it says, working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force, the executive committee. I don't think there was an executive committee. And August Spies saw the flyer and told Adolf Fischer that he would, one, not speak at the rally if this particular flyer was put out, and two, that it was inappropriate and politically not right to use that kind of language in a flyer. And so Adolf Fischer threw out the flyers. They went into the wastebasket at the office of the Arbiter-Zeitung, and they printed a new flyer that took those words off, working men, arm yourself and appear in full force. However, jumping ahead for a moment, the next day on May 4th, or the day after May 4th, May 5th, when the police raided the Arbiter-Zeitung, they found those flyers in the wastebasket, and they were used as evidence to show material support for an alleged conspiracy to commit violence and murder. So the flyer becomes a very important piece of the history of the Haymarket event, and in many ways is the one that wasn't distributed is almost always the one that is shown in the history books and in newspapers and magazines of the day, and even contemporarily. It's the one that is shown when it was not the one that was distributed. There's certainly a small group of people who feel that those of us who try to dispel the myth of worker violence get upset because they want there are some people who can consider themselves anarchists today, and that the idea was that workers should have violently opposed the police. But in fact, I think the evidence is very clear that we all know that the Haymarket affair, the day of the rally itself was actually peaceful, and it ended in those words before the bomb was thrown. So I'll talk a little bit about the events on May 4th. May 4th was turned out to be a particularly lousy day weather-wise. The idea was that the hope was that 20,000 people would show up, because easily 20,000 people could fit in the widening of the street there at Des Plaines and Randolph, Haymarket Square, and as it was known, the Haymarket, where the hay wagons were. And it was a particularly poorly organized event. Speakers didn't show up who were invited. People didn't know about it. In fact, Albert Parsons, the great organizer, was with his wife over near Halstead and Randolph when he was confronted by a reporter who saw him and said, so you're speaking at the rally tonight, do you have bombs in your pockets? And Lucy Parsons said, yeah, sure, we have bombs in our pockets. That's what we do, with, essentially joking, saying we carry bombs in our pockets with our children. And that was reported back to the police and the judicial system. However, Albert didn't know a thing about the rally, and somebody came and found him and said he had been seen and asked him to speak at the rally. So it's material evidence that there couldn't have been a conspiracy. He didn't even know about it. But he did speak later, early on in the evening. So that night, after 7:30, 8 o'clock, when the speakers start, Albert Parsons does get there and speaks. And in fact, he is with his two children, Albert Jr. and Lulu, and his wife, Lucy Parsons. They had mounted the hay wagon. In fact, the reason they were on the hay wagons was because not enough people showed up, and so they kind of moved the rally a little bit to the northeast, where the hay wagons were and where people could get closer in. And there were only 2,500 instead of 20,000, and it was drizzly, rainy, almost stormy type of events brewing, and so stormy weather-wise, and so people weren't patient to stay around. People left quite regularly, and the crowd got smaller and smaller. and the speakers went on for a long time. Albert Parsons goes over to Zeff's Hall right on Lake Street with his wife and kids, with some other people after he speaks, and as he said later on, he goes, when asked about the bombing and did he have anything to do with it, he said, I would bring my children to an event where bombs were going to be thrown. That's crazy. And so, but the vitriol of the efforts of the corporate interests were so powerful and so strong that people were so afraid, based on the portrayal of the evil anarchists, that it was people would believe anything. And that is essentially what happened the day after the Haymarket tragedy. In the short of the story is that there's a rally, people are speaking, people are leaving, people are getting closer to the hay wagon to hear, because it's a smaller group. And a little after 10 o'clock, the mayor, who was standing across the street, Carter Harrison, who was actually pretty friendly with the working classes and well liked, also had little control over his own police force. The big companies, the Pullmans and McCormicks, pretty much had the police department through an Inspector Bonfield on their employ. And when Carter Harrison told the police to go home, they stayed because Bonfield had told them to stay, dismissing the mayor's request. The mayor went home, and at that moment, as it was approaching 10:25, Bonfield's 175 police officers, who were in formation, marched onto the crowd and pushed them all towards the wagon. And Bonfield raised his arm and he said, "In the name of the state, I command you to disperse." At which point, Samuel Fielden, the last speaker of the evening, who was a Methodist lay preacher, raised his arm and said, "But this is a peaceable meeting." And it was at that very moment that he said meeting that people saw the fizz of what we now know as a metal bomb about the size of a baseball that had packed with dynamite. The fuse flew through the air and landed at the front row of police, killing a policeman, Matthias Deegan. It blew out the gas light, and the police immediately began shooting because of the panic and the fear and the darkness. And in the end, 7 policemen died, including Matthias Deegan, and many workers were killed, but there's no exact number that anybody knows about. But some people speculated a dozen, but because of the fear, workers did not report their deaths, but there were all by gunfire, by police gunfire. Workers were not armed, and if they were, they weren't shooting. So it was a tragedy because of the death of everybody, including the police. But the event that transpired was because of the brutality of the business owners in the state who pushed and pushed to try to create this enemy of the people by the so-called anarchists and union leaders. And so the story unfolds after that into a great trial and a great conspiracy.